Hey everybody, this is Andrew. I'm going to go over my final project from MATLAB. I'm going to be going over this in 5 sections. It'll be the demonstration, the movement, the functions, the objects, and the main function. So hope you guys will enjoy my explanations and can get through everything. So now onto the demonstration. So basically, I'm going to be running the no BGM version because I don't want to get copyrighted. If you want to play the BGM version, you'll just have to read the README. And yeah, so you start the game, run the file. You have our instructions here. Cool. You press the button, it closes. You type in our difficulty we want. You want to play normal mode. Cool. We want to play night because nights are cool. And so here's go. We have our portal here, and we are able to move. As you can see here, we can move our player. That's the green. That's the blue box. So now we can enter in by pressing space. And now the projectiles chase us. They follow us around. We run into the enemies to kill them. And look, the projectiles stop moving because they, guess what? They've moved too many times, so they stop moving. And once we kill our players, all the enemies, we can move again. Portal's back. Press space. This is an example of the restroom. There's no enemies, and your HP has gone up. You don't see it, but your HP has gone up, and you can go through again. You die. You get hit by too many enemies. Look, you died. You would say, you see, you defeat 12 enemies, and to play again, close the window, play again. So movement in my game is defined through 4 main things. So we have the key structure, which is a structure containing keys of WASD, all set to false with Boolean values. This here is the basis for keys. So essentially, WASD and space are all set to false, which means they're not being pressed. Then we have a current room, which is a figure, which uses the press key function and the key release function from MATLAB built in that will take that when you press a key, you'll have the key press function. When you release a key, it'll call the key release function. Key press essentially takes, and the event, which is the key press, it'll actually keep and define it as the key that you press, the what it is called. So it checks if that key you pressed is in the field of keys, and if it is, it'll set that key to be true, which means you're pressing it down. And then key release, when you let go of the key, it'll set it to false. Movement is defined by this movement function, where if the key is being pressed down, or if it's true, it'll move your position here, as you see here. And then here, if the goes off of the screen, it'll set it back to the edge of the screen, so it seems like you're walking into a wall. That's how the movement in this game works. Next, we're going to be going over the objects in this game. So objects are basically capsules of data that contain other variables and other pieces of data inside it, and they have their own functions that can only be called through objects. So the player object, which is my own object I defined as a handle, that way it directly modifies the object itself instead of making copies, which MATLAB automatically does. So this way it acts like other object-oriented programs. It contains properties of an X position, a Y position, HP, speed, and physical visual of the player, which I can call the entity. So in this case, the constructor, which is what you actually create the object, you input the X and Y positions, the HP and the speed. These are all inputted by the game main function, which you'll see later, and it sets these values. The entity is a rectangle that's blue, and it has the same position as the object itself. So when you draw the player, it'll basically change. It'll be using 2 new values, and object X equals Y position. So basically it changes the position of the object to the new positions, and then it changes the position of the rectangle to the new position as well. And then it draws on the top. In the move function, this draw player is called constantly in the move function. That way, when you move, it'll take the new and X and Y positions that are defined there and move the player there. Enemies are defined in the enemy object, which is another handle, and it's basically the same as the player object, except does not have speed and has no HP. And it also has an extra function which deletes the entity, which is the visual object of the rectangle itself. So that way, when you want to delete it, this is called, and it'll get rid of it. Nice and easy. Enemy projectiles are really similar to the player objects, except they have a distance traveled, which increases here every time you call the projectile move, where you move it a little bit, and it will increase by 1. Now we move on to the functions of this program. We have the create projectile list, which returns a projectile list that, it takes enemies, and it has projectiles, so it makes a list of the projectiles. Next we have create room, which returns a number of enemies and an enemy list, similar to projectile list, but this time it's an enemy list. So what it does is it makes a random number between 1 and 10, so it gives a 90% chance to get a normal room and a 10% chance to get a restroom. Basically, it'll make a bunch of enemies based on how many number of enemies there are, and then it'll put them in a list and return those 2 values. The calculate distance is really simple. It just so it returns the total distance using the square root, magnitude of a vector. The x distance, which is found through subtraction, the y distance found through subtraction, it returns it, and the distance between 2 things. Finally, we get to the game main, which is the main file that's run in the program. So first off, we have these initialize commands, initialize in the beginning, background music inputs, and then the background music. Music in this game in MATLAB in general, is done through the audio read command, which takes an MP3 and splits it up into its data and the sample rate. The sample rate is then put into the audio player, which takes the data and the sample rate and compiles it into an object that is the audio file that MATLAB can read, and you can play it using the play command. Instructions are done via the message box command, and the UI wait, which just puts a figure on the screen and it doesn't continue until it's closed. Music is on randomly here. You input some stuff to get values. These values are changed. And then here is the box you put into. Here's when you make the player. We call it the constructor, which we saw earlier. So now we get to the game loop. The game loop is pretty complex, and so, as you know, the enemies are stored in an enemy list, and the projectiles are stored in the projectile list. The player is an object that is its own little thing. So first we check if the player has HP. If it doesn't, we close everything and we break ends the loop, because the loop checks if it's valid. Current room is valid. If all things are closed, current room is not valid, it'll end. So now we have number of enemies. We have number equals 0, so you start or your enemies are dead. You have a portal in the middle of the screen. It's pretty simple. These are there for optimization. And if you get close enough to the portal and you press space, you will clear everything, so everything will disappear. You'll put yourself back in the base where you started, and everything will be set to false. This way, if you're holding W when you go into a portal, it's not going to keep holding W. You're going to stay still for a bit. Then you're going to call create room and projectile list. We saw those earlier. Now enemy list exists because you called this. And now we have double index. I represents the enemies. J represents the projectiles. Since they're stored in a list, we go through each individual enemy and each individual projectile in their own list at the same time, at the same index. So they're all connected by the index number, which is 1 here. And while there's less than the number of enemies, basically, you know how many enemies there are, we check if the projectile has moved a bit enough. If it hasn't, we calculate the distance between the projectile and the player, and we move the projectile. Then we calculate the distance between the player and the enemy. If the enemy is close enough to the player, the enemy will delete itself, and number of enemies is reduced because there's one less enemy, and enemies count goes up. If the projectile is close to the player will take damage, reduce their HP, they'll flash red for a second, and the projectile will delete itself. After those are done, your index will go up, and you go to the next projectile in the list. So once the player's dead or has no time left, they die, we close all. The figure's it doesn't exist anymore. We close all so nothing else comes up, and we start our music again, and we have an end box that tells us how many enemies we killed. So hope you guys have fun playing the game. You can find the download in the description, or you can, on GitHub, there'll be if you want to get the audio version, read the README file and the audio file. You'll learn what to do from there. Have fun, guys.